All right, let's do this. Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Eugene's March 13th, 2026 program, Challenges in the DA's Office. My name is Thomas Hura. I'm a member and volunteer with the City Club, and it's my honor to welcome you to another of the many forums we've held since 1990 in the name of our mission to build community vision through open inquiry. City Club is fortunate to be a trusted, open, and independent voice for Eugene area community members to be heard. And as a lifelong Eugenian, I believe the community is fortunate to have the City Club, but particularly to hear from our program guests and questions from the audience, whether here in the beautiful Wow Hall, online, or over the radio. Anyone who attends a City Club forum has equal access to asking questions in our space. We believe these gatherings and broadcasts around critical community topics strengthen our understanding of one another and ultimately our ability to support the community building work in so many sectors of the Eugene area. In today's fractured information landscape especially, we want to be a place where you can participate in unearthing, disseminating, and sharing relevant information in conversation together. We would love for you to browse our past programs at cityclubofeugene.org or our YouTube or Facebook. Please consider becoming a member if you'd like to support our rigorous volunteer work as Oregon's only city club with a weekly forum schedule. There are many ways to partner with us, and I'd like to thank our Diamond community sponsors. The University of Oregon has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically since 1876. Get more information at uoregon.edu. Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. For more information, visit lanecc.edu. Thank you to the City of Eugene and to Lane County for their support, and to our web host, 9 Planets, whose website support is critical to our functioning, making it easy to sign up as a member, donate, or learn more about us. Quick reminder, please silence all devices in the hall. And now I'll turn the mic over to the chair of the program committee, Joel Corin.
Today's program is about law and order. So I felt it appropriate to start out with, in the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups: the police, who investigate the crime, and the district attorneys, who prosecute the offenders. These are their stories. Apparently there are no law and order viewers here in the audience. The problems in the DA's office are mind-boggling. They're underpaid, they're understaffed, they're overworked. The reality is that there are 24 assistant district attorneys, and the case numbers for 2025 were 4,840 cases filed. Now, I did the math. That's 201.666 cases per prosecutor in the system. That's unsustainable. The advent of technology has made things even more difficult. Back in the day, when I was practicing criminal law, you'd get papers, you'd get the arrest records, you'd get the notes of the investigation, but you didn't get hours and hours of videotape. You didn't get hours and hours of body camera tape. So there was just less to go through as you were getting ready for trial. Describing the issue as a, quote, looming crisis, District Attorney Prosa fears a mass exodus of prosecutors similar to the 18-month period in 2021 and 2022 when 16 prosecutors left the office. So Chris Prosa, who will be our speaker today, graduated from Oregon State University with the BS in political science and earned a JD degree from the University of Oregon Law School. He's been a lifelong prosecutor, starting out in Josephine County in 2004 and then joining the Lane County Prosecutor's Office in April of 2006. Following assignments in general felony and major crimes, Chris became the felony trial team leader before accepting the Chief Deputy District Attorney position in 2021. In May of 2024, Chris was elected District Attorney of Lane County. And he also serves on the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission and serves as a member of the Board of Directors of Kids First, Lane County's Child Advocacy Center. Chris Prosa.
Well, I very much appreciate that introduction. I will say Joel did a fantastic job laying out the problem we have in Lane County, and maybe I'm not needed here today. Hang on just a moment while I get my life in order. I'm very excited to be here today. This is the second or third time I've talked, third time I believe, in front of the City Club. And it's always an honor to be in front of the community and discussing the criminal justice system as a whole, but also the DA's office in particular and some of the challenges that we face going into the future. This is my favorite part of the job. I like to talk to community members. I like to travel through the community and ultimately have conversations with people, as I see that to be my primary responsibility here. I've noticed over time that ultimately there seems to be an erosion of basic civic understanding to some degree. Many people that I interact with have no idea what a district attorney does or what our office does. So I'm going to take a few moments just to describe for you the district attorney's office, because many people have a concept of it but don't know all of the responsibilities that we hold. And then we're going to get into kind of the crisis that we are facing here in Lane County with regard to public safety generally, but within the district attorney's office specifically. So the district attorney's office is, it's actually 3 divisions in total. We have a family law division, we call it that. What it really is child support enforcement. So you can imagine that when a couple gets together and has children, but the case or their relationship ultimately dissolves, they're in splitting up their lives, there often is a parent who has more custody over the children than another. And when that happens, that person, the custodial parent, is usually entitled legally to some child support, right? To help and to provide the basic needs. The non-custodial parent's obligated to contribute to the basic needs of the children. It probably won't surprise many of you to learn that there are instances, either by circumstance or just potentially hard feelings, where people do not pay the child support they've been ordered by the court to ultimately pay. When that happens, we are a service to the custodial parent where they can contact us and we will help them seek additional court orders to ultimately enforce that child support so that kids can have things like food, shelter, clothing, and even support for things like activities. We have 5 attorneys in that unit, 4 legal secretaries, 3 office assistants, and 1 investigator. That unit generates on any given year, between $16 and $22 million for Lane County families. We're very proud of that number. That's a lot of money for people who really need it. These are some of the most vulnerable victims or people in our community, and this money goes a long way to help those custodial parents ultimately pay for those needs. That division is 2/3 funded by the federal government. We get a grant that ultimately pays for 2/3 of all that employee staff that I just listed. The county pays 1/3 of the cost to do that. So as you think about it, when we ultimately go through periods of, say, budget reduction, because we get so much bang for the buck, $1, they get $3 worth of employee out of it. So we don't cut that unit when ultimate budget reductions happen, because it ultimately would be essentially cutting off our nose to spite our face. And we're very proud of the fact that we're helping usually single mothers obtain the money that is necessary to ultimately help them raise their children. That is very important to this community, and it keeps kids, frankly, out of becoming folks who see me in my other divisions, primarily the criminal division later in life. So we don't cut from that unit. The medical legal death investigations division is another unit within my office. Under Oregon law, we are obligated as a county to ultimately provide the state medical examiner's office a number of things, to include investigators who can be kind of at-scene investigators for our local deputy state medical examiner, who is charged ultimately with determining the cause and manner of death in any suspicious or unattended death that happens in our community. Obviously, one deputy medical examiner can't be at all the investigations that ultimately happen or deaths that occur here in Lane County. So he has medical legal death investigators that the county employs to ultimately operate those investigations and then hand it off to him at the point in which it's appropriate, either for autopsy or to ultimately evaluate their investigation and make some call on cause and manner of death. We have 5 medical legal death investigators here in Lane County and 1 supervisor who is board certified as a medical legal death investigator, and she provides additional help to that unit to be able to provide 24/7 coverage to our community for those suspicious or unattended deaths. This is a unit that does approximately, over the last 3 or 4 years, has done 1,500 or more investigations a year. That's a lot. And we're obligated to provide 24/7 coverage to the community all across Lane County, from Oak Ridge to Florence, from Coburg to Cottage Grove, for those suspicious and unattended deaths that ultimately happen in our community. In order to have 24/7 coverage so that we don't have deceased people laying in place, for example, or remaining in their homes for long periods of time, we have to have those investigators on hand to determine where to take those bodies, where the appropriate location for those bodies to ultimately go, pending the investigations in those cases. So they may be going to the morgue, they may be going to a funeral home or something like that. So we have to provide that service by law to the community. And to provide 24/7 coverage for that, we have to ultimately maintain the numbers that we have in that unit. So I'm not allowed really to cut from that unit either when reduction times happen. The third division is one you'll all be familiar with because it's the division that ultimately is represented in TV and movies, and that is the criminal division. And this is, of course, our biggest unit. And their primary responsibility is simply to enforce the laws of the state of Oregon. These are not my laws. These are your laws. These laws were all created by you through representatives in the legislature, passed through the legislative process, and ultimately signed into existence by our governor under our legislative system. We have 24 attorneys in the criminal division, 5 paralegals, 6 legal secretaries, 9 office assistants, 2 investigators, one of whom joined me today, and 7.5 victim advocates. This is the location in the unit that is most subject to being cut when we see budget reductions. And that's because our generalized obligation is to enforce the law, right? That's something that we're easily able to kind of work around more than enforcing child support or ultimately leaving deceased people out in the community. So this has been the area of the office that has been most hit by budget instability over the course of the last, really, 40 or 50 years. The mantra in the criminal division has long been that we'll just do more with less. And that has been a philosophy that for a long time really worked for us, but it doesn't work anymore. We've hit the point of utter exhaustion and overburden to the point where we are really at risk of ultimately losing the dedicated personnel that exist in my office because they simply have too many cases and too much work to do in the limited time that we are provided by life. I want to give you some context for 24 prosecutors. 24 prosecutors is one less prosecutor than Lane County had in 1985, when we had 40% less population in Lane County. In 2004, Doug Harkerode, the district attorney at that time, ultimately had brought in the American Prosecutors Research Institute to conduct a study. It was a very intense, in-depth study where they basically had us track our time, every way we'd use our time throughout the course of the day, to include when we went home and to categorize how many times we'd think about our various cases throughout it. After they did an exhaustive study of our office, they ultimately determined that in 2004, we should have 7.12 more prosecutors in the criminal division than we have had in that time frame, 2004. We had 20% lower population in Lane County in 2004. We have not only not gained prosecutors since that time, we've taken a step back in that we now have one less than we had in 2004. And despite this tremendous burden, my staff has done a tremendous job of trying to adjust to that. And the way they ultimately do that is by working longer hours and having significantly less free time to themselves. I want to give you some numbers. Joel talked about the number of cases filed. I recently pulled the 2025 statistics for our unit to give some indication of the workload that we face. We had 6,721 criminal referrals come to our office from our law enforcement partners here in Lane County. 6,721 cases that 24 prosecutors had to review and make decisions on that required them to not only, as Joel mentioned, read police reports, view photographs that may exist, but also watch videos and things like that that came with it to make a determination as to whether or not we had adequate evidence, meaning proof beyond a reasonable doubt, to prove the charges. Of those 6,700 cases, we charged 4,155 cases. That's 61.8% of the law enforcement referrals that came to my office got charged. In a typical year, traditionally, we charge somewhere between 70 and 75% of the cases that law enforcement refers to us. The only time I've seen numbers like 61.8% before was when we were going through COVID and we began to lose prosecutors, and we categorically limited the types of charges that we would prosecute in our office as a means of addressing our resource limitations. What this tells me is that my prosecutors are having a terrible time getting through the work that's coming through the door. They cannot manage the cases that are coming through for us to evaluate, examine, and then make charging decisions on. And that troubles me greatly. But in addition to the typical criminal cases that come through my office, we did 358 probation violations. We handled 112 public records requests to include cases like the interagency deadly force investigation cases that are of high interest to the public, and ultimately the public and media often want to see copies of those investigations to determine whether the decision I made as to whether or not to charge an involved officer or not was the right decision, and I support that wholeheartedly. But with each of those cases, including, I had my staff recently run some numbers on how long it took them to process one of those interagency deadly force investigation team investigations. It took them 14 to 16 hours to ultimately prep those for release to the media or to the public. And that's because we are obligated by law to ultimately redact any information that could unreasonably expose the privacy of individuals in those cases. So every video, whether surveillance or body cam, Every report, everything in that case has to be redacted so that folks are not embarrassed in some way or their privacy somehow invaded by our public disclosure of that information. It's a tremendous resource drain for us. We also did 30 post-conviction, I'm sorry, we did 18 public records appeals. Many people don't understand that when you request public records from a governmental entity, they go through and they evaluate whether or not that it is the material you're requesting is actually subject to being turned over to the public or not. And they, on occasion, will tell you, no, that there's an exception to the public records requirement that ultimately says we don't have to turn that over to you. What folks don't realize is that the appellate body to make a determination on that is the district attorney's office. So when somebody believes that a governmental agency has failed to provide them documentation they are entitled to, my attorneys have to ultimately evaluate those to determine whether or not there is a violation of law that occurred and have to make a ruling like an appellate court would on whether or not the documents are subject to public release or not. That takes an extraordinary amount of time, primarily because that's a field of law we don't often practice in. We did 1,337 expungements last year. That's a tremendous number of cases. Those are motions filed that we must respond to, and then hearings that we have to show up to ultimately determine whether or not a person gets a criminal charge expunged from their record. And I'll tell you, that's a 450% increase over pre-2022 timeframes. And that's because we saw a change of law that took effect in 2022 that liberalized the standards for our expungement statutes. Since then, we've literally had around 1,300 to 1,400 cases per year of expungements that our attorneys have to respond to. We've had 30 post-conviction relief cases. For those who don't know, that once you're done with the appellate process in the criminal realm, you have the ability to challenge actions made by your defense attorney. And if ultimately a court determines that your defense attorney made an egregious enough mistake that it could have affected the outcome of the case, they send the case back to the circuit court for basically retrial and re-examination to ultimately determine whether or not a person should have been convicted for those crimes. 30 is an enormous number for us. On a typical year, I would say before 2020, we would get maybe 2 a year, and now we're getting, in 2025, 30 of them that we're having to basically relitigate from the very beginning. We provided 27,984 services to 3,525 victims in Lane County last year. And of those, we provided 1,726, or helped 1,726 victims of crimes seek and obtain protective orders against people that were somehow abusing or attacking them. And while all that work volume is a lot, what's really breaking the camel's back here, if I'm being very candid, is what Joel had mentioned. That's a lot of work for 24 people to ultimately handle. But what has absolutely caused us to go from struggling but surviving to outwardly failing right now is the proliferation of digital media evidence in our society. Now, don't get me wrong. It is absolutely fantastic evidence, right? Body cameras, the ubiquitous nature of surveillance throughout our system are awesome tools to helping us understand the truth of what happened in a circumstance. The problem is that there is a ton of manpower that is required to ultimately review all that material. When I started my career in 2004, as Joel mentioned, it was not uncommon to a whole case that you would have to evaluate was a couple, maybe 3, 4 police reports, some analog photographs, and if you were really lucky, you were dealing with a rich police agency that ultimately had in-car video. Today, it takes, if 3 officers show up to the scene of a crime and they ultimately are conducting an investigation, which is typical today, you may have 4, 5, 6, even longer hours of video review you have to do in order to be able to determine whether or not you are going to do the right thing in the case, which is make a determination that you have evidence beyond a reasonable doubt or not. It's not enough when you have evidence of what each witness said, what the victim may have said, to simply rely on a summarization by the law enforcement officers. You kind of have to see it for yourself, right? To see exactly what they said, to make sure that the officer got it right. That takes an inordinate amount of time. And I can tell you that ultimately we are at the point now where we just don't have enough hours in the day to be able to do the review necessary. And when that happens, ultimately the prosecutors begin to question whether or not they are doing the right thing or not. These 24 attorneys love this community. They want to provide community protection. They want to protect victims, but they want to do it right. They want to make sure that they have the evidence to ultimately be able to prosecute a potential offender or not. When you don't have the time to review all the evidence, you can't be sure whether or not you're doing the right thing. And that is a horrific feeling for a prosecutor. And I'll tell you now that when you get overworked, when you get overburdened, and you don't feel you are doing a good job for your community anymore, guess what these highly marketable people choose to do? They decide to leave the job. They can find higher paying jobs that require less work out in the marketplace. They're everywhere, which is exactly what we saw happen in 2021 and 2022 when we lost 16 prosecutors in 18 months, which had a horrible effect to this community. Not only did we have to implement a list of charges that we were not going to file on, which very much upset our community, especially the business community, because it affected them more harshly than others. It also caused us to have an experience drain in our office because we couldn't replicate prosecutors who had 10, 12, 15 years of experience by simply going out into the marketplace and finding them. You can't find them. They're already with existing DA's offices. So we had to backfill by hiring first-year prosecutors that don't have the experience, that aren't as efficient as experienced attorneys at ultimately doing. I told you about expungements and the burden that is imposed on us, and post-conviction relief, and the pending, the additional workload that those cases have imposed. We do face the office. In the event we begin to lose people like we did in 2021, 2022, the criminal justice system in Lane County will totally collapse. I want to give you a little perspective here. We've all heard about the public defender crisis in the state of Oregon. That's been well publicized. The legislature's been dealing with it for years now, trying to get a handle on that. In Lane County, we have 50 state-contracted indigent public defenders that work here in the circuit court. I have 24 attorneys, and my attorneys bear the burden of proof in every case. So we're mindful as a society of the fact that defense attorneys can't be overworked or they might generate bad product. But let me ask you, if you have overburdened prosecutors, what do you think the outcome to community safety and justice ultimately will be? We might find ourselves ultimately in a position where, because of prosecutors being overworked, Folks that ultimately shouldn't be charged with crimes are being charged with crimes because the prosecutor simply didn't have the time to go through all the evidence, because he had 5 or 6 more cases he had to get to, or she had to get to, before the lunch hour and the filing deadline for those cases. This is a catastrophic problem that we are facing in this community, and one that will have to be addressed in the coming years, or we are going to see instances where people were drugged through the criminal justice system that shouldn't have been. And had we had more time, had we had more people in our office, they wouldn't have been. So I am very concerned about what's going to happen. We have far too many cases and far too many extra assignments that my prosecutors have to hold. Many people don't know this, but we provide 24/7 coverage to the community in the form of, we have on-call deputies for various assignments: homicides, vehicular homicides, for officer-involved deadly force investigations, and police legal advisor. When I started in this office, if a person was on duty for a weekend and covering the police legal advisor pager, ultimately they would get maybe 1 or 2 calls in a weekend. Today, these same prosecutors that carry that burden, it's now 5 as opposed to 1, are getting 5 or 6 calls a night to review search warrants and things of that nature. If you worked as hard as these folks do from Monday to Friday and then don't get to sleep on the weekends, where do you think your head is at when you come back to work on that following Monday? They are not getting downtime, and that is a tremendous concern. And they will break at some point, and the system will collapse if they do choose to take those higher paying jobs with less work elsewhere. I could talk on this issue. I was laughing with Craig, who is our lead investigator in the district attorney's office, on the way over here. I could talk about this subject for hours, but I don't have the time to do so. I've already gotten the 5-minute warning, so I do want and hope you will participate in asking some questions of me. It doesn't have to be related to workload issues, but anything that you are interested in, because I want the community to understand the problems that we have in the criminal justice system, and there are many that need to be addressed. So please, feel free to ask me any questions you may have.
Thank you, DA Prosa. Before we begin that Q&A, a special thank you to our award-winning public radio station, KLCC, for airing City Club programs on Mondays at 7 p.m. In the metro area of Lane County, they broadcast on 89.7 FM, and in Florence on KLFO 88.1 FM. For those listening at home or in transit right now, your household is one of several thousand tuning into City Club on KLCC. We're grateful and honored to have you every time that we broadcast. You can also find all recent City Club programs archived at klcc.org, as well as on our YouTube channel and the City Club Q&A.
your phone here? Don't forget it. Okay, folks, we're about ready to start the question and answer period. There's a line over there. Feel free to join it. That way I won't have to ask my 2 pages of questions. Kelly?
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name's Kelly. I'm a City Club board member. I have 2 questions. So the first one, could you talk a little bit more about the financial picture? You talked about it in one division, but what are the cuts you're experiencing that are kind of forcing this constriction?
It's a great question. So, and hopefully you can hear me all well. So 2 years ago, we received a 5% reduction of my budget. All of that basically came from our criminal division. Last year, we received a 1.2% reduction in my budget. Criminal division was, of course, targeted from that. And this year, we are facing, again, a financial deficit, as all governments are right now. And we're looking at the prospect potentially of about a 2.5% cut again. And as you go through, you know, in years past, we've run so lean and mean that we've cut all the material and supplies costs and things of that nature, that now any kind of reduction is people. We're just at the point with our budget where there is no fat to trim. We're down to bone, and every reduction means I lose staff. So we're looking at the prospect of additional staff reductions this year, which is potentially devastating.
Your budget is solely from the county?
Solely from the county. We do get some grants from the federal government for things like we get a Victims of Violence Against Women Act money that ultimately comes from the federal government, and then we get some Victims of Crime Act money from the federal government as well, but it really is a targeted spending, so we hire specific positions to cover that.
Second question, and not that I would actually really want this, but just curious, has there been any investigation to see how AI could be helpful in reducing, like you said, watching like endless videos? Could AI like cut dead space or be helpful in any way?
We're hopeful that it will. It is really the Wild West with AI right now, and in fact that's a big rage in the Oregon District Attorneys Association, is talking about AI and AI policies and what's an appropriate ethical use of AI in the context of criminal justice in particular. And so yes, we're investigating that, and I know, you know, the head of our technology services in Lane County is a big proponent of AI and how we can use it, and we're having conversations about how we may be able to use it to minimize some of the time needed to review and potentially edit those videos for their use in a courtroom. But we don't have answers to that yet. And frankly, you know, lawyers are good at a lot of things. Technology is maybe not our strong suit in a lot of areas, and I'm the worst offender of that. So a lot of times I'll sit in these meetings about AI and it just is zooming over my head. So I wish I had somebody technically with the expertise to ultimately put out the AI for Dummies book or something. Thank you.
Sir?
Hello, Chris. Lanny Ball, City Club member.
Nice.
Say, I understand you've seen a lot of cases. Is that correct?
Throughout my career?
Yes.
Thousands and thousands.
Okay,
yeah.
great. That's just what I wanted to hear. You know, I've got an idea. It's way out there.
Okay.
I'd like the judge to make people like you that's seen enough cases and be approved by the judge through his knowing you and by your demeanor and so on, to make you an underjudge in a lot of these cases. Not, you know, the real bad one, but a lot of them. You could thin out the thing if he gives you that power and under his supervision, you know, if he sees something going haywire. But I think he could do it if he would approve that. And man, that could eliminate a lot of stuff. You could say, I've seen your case before. I'm going to have to do this.
Yeah. And I hear you on that. I got to say I have a little different take on that in that, I represent the state of Oregon in any action. It's state of Oregon versus whoever the suspect ultimately is. And I am me and my attorneys are ultimately the advocates for the people of the state of Oregon in those cases. That person who's on the other side of the V in those cases is the person who has all the constitutional rights and protections, right? And due process is bedrock principle in the United States of America. Having a prosecutor simply make determinations, for example, of what should happen in a case really runs afoul of everything we've set up in this. And I know it would expedite things,
Yeah.
but then I'm acting more as a king, right?
Yeah.
Than I am as a participant in this judicial system. And I'd rather keep my job. I get it. When we talk about a community that ultimately is, when you look at total tax load in our community, in all jurisdictions in our community, we're talking about, you guys are really highly taxed. That's the reality when you do your full tax burden. The county gets very little of that money, and it's that pays for the district attorney's office and the sheriff's office. So, we're probably in a position where the only answer to, more prosecutors is going to be some additional tax, and we're going to have to figure out how to ultimately do it to fund the services you want and you think you need. And if you think you need more prosecutors because you're afraid that we might not prosecute crimes if ultimately they go away, then we're going to have to do some evaluation and prioritization on what we're willing to pay for and what we're not.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi there. It's almost like you teed that up for me. I'm Mary Vuxit-Schaefer. I'm the assessor tax collector of Lane County. And my question to you, District Attorney, is how many prosecutors would you need to start seeing some relief for your current staff?
I mean, one prosecutor in addition would be some relief, right? But the reality is Mary and I were talking in the break, and ultimately she's saying, what would you need to do what you think would be C-quality work, which I thought was a unique way to ask that question. And the truth is we probably need at least 5 to 7 more people, attorneys, to ultimately be getting to the point where we would feel like we are doing the kind of work we were doing back in 2004 when we had that. To get us to...
Susan Connolly, City Club member. Thank you for coming.
Of course.
Many years ago, I worked for the Alaska Public Defender Agency, and but we still worked really, really hard. Mm-hmm. And the DA. The question I have is, we had a statewide system, and I'm wondering if, all of our systems are understaffed. The DAs, the PDs, the law enforcement, the courts, maybe not the courts quite as much. They're all understaffed. Has anyone ever, or would it ever work for all those forces to get together to try for a statewide system?
Yes, we've tried. Great question. And the truth is, what's really funny and ironic is, as the district attorney, the elected district attorney of Lane County, I'm a state employee. But state law requires that it's the county's obligation to ultimately provide me all of my staffing. So originally, the concept was in the state of Oregon that district attorneys would all be state employees, and ultimately we would do the work of criminal prosecution and the like as state employees. Hence the reason why it's state of Oregon versus whoever. But we went away from that as a means of cutting costs to the states and foisting it at some level on local jurisdictions to pay for the additional support staff that was needed to ultimately do the work that is required in a district attorney's office. There are many groups that would love to see the system overhauled and ultimately it become a state-funded system. Public defense, for example, is still a state-funded body. All the public defenders are paid through the state. I don't know that you're going to get from the state a lot of interest in taking on entire DA staffs as state employees anymore. That's a cost that unfortunately long ago was foisted onto local communities, and I don't see them taking it back, unfortunately.
Hello. I'm Kathleen Willett, a member of City Club. Thank you for your very compelling presentation. I understand your dilemma. You're not the only public service entity to come to us with the same issues. How do you feel about a statewide sales tax? Is this the time to really initiate something like that, unpopular as it has been?
Yeah, we have, in my free time, we love to talk about tax policy. And
Be careful, you have to run for office again.
yeah, I know. It's interesting. What I think about ultimately taxes and tax policy is that I think we can use tax policy as a means to incentivize things we like and disincentivize things we don't, right? And unfortunately, when you tax, for example, property, we're disincentivizing at some level property ownership. And there's a misnomer out there, I know, that people who think they rent don't pay property tax. You do. The cost gets passed on to you by your landlord and such. Taxing income is another way, like you're disincentivizing at some level people working, and I think that's problematic. And it's not necessarily fairly imposed. Either of those taxes, frankly, aren't as fairly imposed as I'd like to see. I do think that sales tax is at least somewhat equitable. The more you spend, the more you pay, right? The more consumption you engage in, the more you pay. Those who have less are inherently going to pay less because they're not buying as much. But, I'm not a politician that, deals with tax all that much. It's a fun thing. Mary and I were actually just talking about tax policy and ideas for taxes and stuff. I'm just not an expert in that area, and I lean on people who are smarter than me that understand this far better than I do to ultimately create a system that is fair and one that meets the needs of what our community wants for its public services to ultimately meet those needs. And so that's why we hire or elect, if you will, our legislators and our governor and those folks to ultimately make those policy decisions on what is fair and equitable for the people of the state of Oregon and for residents of Lane County in particular.
Next question?
Hi, thanks for being here. My name is Mike Bartkoff, and I'm a Wow Hall member.
Nice.
And my question is, I'm wondering what kind of options that all these governments are looking at to replace funding.
It's a good question. The conversation's been had. Many of you know that we had a public safety task force that the commissioners put together. I think it was in 2023 they initially started it. The group worked through 24, 25, or early part of 25, and ultimately generated a report for our commissioners on ways that we can address the public safety needs in Lane County. And they came up with a number of ideas. And yes, additional taxes were amongst the ideas to ultimately generate revenue to pay for things like more prosecutors, but also rural patrol, right? We underserve our rural population in this county because the sheriff's office doesn't have enough personnel to ultimately be able to adequately patrol and investigate crimes that happen in our rural community. We have a jurisdiction the size of Connecticut, 4,700 square miles, and on any given Friday or Saturday night, the sheriff has 3 deputies on duty patrolling that entire area, if you can imagine that. 3. That is shockingly below state and national averages. But he's in the same financial situation that the district attorney's office has been. In the end, they're going to lose the potential at having rural patrol altogether, because if they can't provide minimum staffing, it's not safe to even have any of their people out there, and they are coming dangerously close to losing that ability as well. And who gets hurt by that? Our rural community.
Chris, you're in competition with the public defender's office and private practices for new lawyers. What are the salary differences between the DA's office, the public defender's office, and private practice?
It used to be real disparate, if I'm being honest with you, in favor of district attorneys. We got paid far more than defense attorneys did. There has been a tremendous amount of change in that, the way that defense attorneys are paid today. And we actually had a prosecutor that retired from our office, not due to workload or anything. It was just his time. He'd spent 30 years in our office not long ago. And we were having a conversation about it, and he left our office making, you know, handsome, what I like to think is we're not horribly underpaid as DAs, but he's now doing some part-time defense work out there and making far more money doing that than he ever did earning as a prosecutor, which I found interesting. They needed to get paid more. Public defenders needed to get paid more for what they do, and they are very important in our system. The way I like to look at this is, in order for the criminal justice system to work appropriately and function the way all of us would want it to, is you got to have good people in all positions, right? Good prosecutors, good defense attorneys, good judges. So I'm not here to say that I think that our people are underpaid.
19. In the education community, sometimes we talk about growing your own, and we've got 3 great law schools here in Oregon. You attended University of Oregon for your JD. Is there any impact that can have with trying to get folks involved through local law schools?
Yes, at some level, and we've had a great partnership with the University of Oregon for as long as I've been in this office, and in fact, I was actually part of our law student program. When I was at the University of Oregon, I did the prosecution clinic through Doug Harkleroad, who was the DA at that time, but I actually did my work up in Multnomah County, in Portland area, for those classes. We have a great partnership with the University of Oregon as far as we find tremendous candidates from there. We find people who are interested in doing the job. They come to us. We get to kind of do, if you will, a 12 to 18 month job interview with them where they act as mini DAs for a while. And frankly, I don't know what our percentage is of people who've gone through the clinic, but of the attorneys we have currently on staff, I would bet you a fair share of them are former U of O clinic members that actually went through that process, to include myself, that ultimately, so we use it for recruitment in that way, and it's been fantastic. And the University of Oregon, Lewis and Clark, and Willamette all produce some really, really amazing students. So those institutions are extremely helpful. We don't get funding, though, however, to, for example, hire them on as extra help. I don't have a budget for that, and those folks can go out and work at places that ultimately will pay them for summer work. So.
Mary?
Yeah, Google says 60 to 80,000 beginning salary in Lane County for a public defender, average 83, which is 23% lower than the national average. I actually did have a question. You talked earlier about something about expunging 1,000 something, and I thought, I don't know what that means.
Oh,
so
good.
Give me an example
That's
of a definition and an example.
So an expungement or a set-aside, it's known as both things in the state, is when you ultimately you have a criminal record, and depending upon the type of crime it is, and the length of time you've gone crime-free, you can have that removed from your record entirely. So a person who's committed, for example, a low-level property offense, maybe even a felony level, like a Class C felony of theft in the first degree, or identity theft or something like that. It used to be that you had to wait, I think it was 8 years under the old statute, to come back before the court and try and have that removed from your record. Now it's like 3 years to ultimately have them removed from their record. And so folks are coming in much quicker and much more. And frankly, there are entire movements. Many of the law schools are running expungement clinics and things like that, which are bringing a lot of people through the door for those purposes.
I don't know about the orders here in Oregon, but in New Jersey, an expungement record includes a line that says you can lie about your record. You can say that I never had I never was arrested. So that's the only way it's effective.
I don't know if we phrase them quite like that, but
Well,
but you don't have a criminal record. An expungement is a legal, literally, it wipes away your criminal conviction so you don't have one in the state of Oregon. So you can honestly check the box to say, I do not have a criminal conviction or record.
go ahead.
DA Prosa, I'm Jensina Hawkins, and I'm a City Club member. You've given us a ton of statistics. Now tell me a story. Tell me something that, as a prosecutor, you are just absolutely most proud of in your career personally.
Wow. Many, many cases, I can tell you, as you asked that question, I had a flood of faces come through my mind, if I'm not going to lie. And it was faces of victims, faces of people I've interacted with, frankly, faces of people I've prosecuted through time that ultimately, I just had this happen recently at a deflection graduation where a gentleman walked up to me and said that, do you remember me? And of course, I'm like, oh man, I don't. And he said his name, and I remembered the name. It was a gentleman I had prosecuted and sent to prison many, many years ago. And he didn't work directly with the deflection program, but he's doing a similar thing. He's doing peer navigation for another service. And he was at the deflection program because he'd been working with one of our graduates. And he had introduced himself and said, I'm this person. And I got to tell you that the job was never personal for me. I was just doing my job and my duty to the community. And so I love it when people like that come up to me out of the blue and say things and talk to me about their case or ultimately the way interactions we've had. But I get that with victims too, and that's when you know you're having some meaningful impact with people. And that's what really fills my soul, if I'm being honest, is when ultimately you run into these folks in the community, often years later, and you have real positive interactions with folks, even if you prosecuted them. This gentleman was telling me, you saved my life. I wouldn't have quit drugs if I didn't go to prison at this time. And now he's helping others recover from controlled substances. What an amazing story. That's a heroic story that it filled my heart with joy.
Chris, in 30 seconds, what can the public do to help?
We're going to have an honest conversation, and it's probably going to come to a discussion of prioritization. What do we want to prioritize in our society as far as things that we're willing to spend our precious resources on? And I want everyone to participate in that conversation. If in the end you ultimately tell me that, we're paying too much, I would totally understand that. But we're going to have an open conversation in our community about what we want from our criminal justice system and ultimately determine as a society, as a group, what we're going to do to begin to address these problems in the criminal justice system.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thomas?
That's all the time for today. Please join Joel and I in thanking Lane County District Attorney Chris Prosa. This has been our March 13th, 2026 conversation at the City Club of Eugene. We'll be back next here at Wow Hall in downtown Eugene on Friday, March 20th at noon. That program is called New Directors, New Visions, Eugene Ballet, and Eugene Symphony. It's sure to be a great forum, and we're looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you all. Have a great weekend or week. We'll see you next time at the City Club.